Here we are in the home's library. The library was meant to showcase the Browns' education. Margaret herself continued her own education by attending classes at the Carnegie Institute when they opened up a women's college. Both of the children, Larry and Helen, also attended schools, first here in Denver, and then later on East Coast or over in Europe. Margaret loved learning new things, and while living in Leadville and then here in Denver, she hired tutors to teach her art, music, and languages. She spoke French, Italian, German, and Russian, as well as some Gaelic and later Greek. Speaking to a reporter in 1922, Margaret said, "Shouldn't a passion for knowledge count for something in one's own development?" These language skills would come in handy in the aftermath of the Titanic. Margaret was in her room reading when the Titanic struck an iceberg. After dressing warmly and grabbing around $500 to place in her pocket, Margaret headed up to the deck and began helping women and children into the lifeboats once they were being lowered to the water. She herself was eventually placed in lifeboat number 6. She and 23 other people spent the night in a lifeboat meant for 65, rowing to keep warm and keep up their courage. Early the next morning, the only ship to respond to Titanic's distress calls was the Carpathia, which arrived at the scene around 5 a.m. and rescued the 705 survivors out of the 2,200 total who had been on board. Margaret helped others once on board the Carpathia by using her knowledge of languages to translate for the second and third class passengers. She raised money for the women and children who had survived without their husbands and fathers. She was a co-creator of the Titanic Survivors Committee. Margaret would later write an account of her experience for the Newport Herald, and it was reprinted by newspapers across the country. She strongly criticized the White Star Line for how they had handled the disaster. As chair of the Survivors Committee, in May of 1912, Margaret returned to New York to present a trophy and award medals to the captain and crew of the Carpathia. And although many of the victims were never found, Margaret would make it her life's work to ensure they were all remembered. Speaking to a Denver Post reporter, Margaret said, "The Titanic disaster was a tragedy that was as unnecessary as running the Brown Palace Hotel into Pikes Peak." We encourage you to think about what can you do to help others in a troubling time.